Hi everybody, Professor Gassimi here. In this component of the lecture, we will be discussing the topic of phonetics. Now, when we existed earlier in the lifetime of our species, the evidence suggests that we weren't writing things down when we wanted to communicate, but we were using spoken words to convey ideas and messages and make strategies about how to hunt and whatever else we were doing. But as time went on, we decided we needed ways to communicate without us physically being present to perform the communication at all times. And obviously creating visual representations of spoken ideas became one way that we could go about performing those conveyances. The idea is that in the earliest times, we conveyed ideas pictographically. So, for example, if I wanted to tell you that there was a hospital nearby, I might draw a picture of a hospital or use a nice big blue symbol with a white H in the middle. And as we all know, we continue to use pictographs to the current day to communicate ideas to each other. But of course, the problem with these pictographic representations is what? Well, especially if you're living in an older time where you had to draw all these things out by hand, it would take a really long time if you wanted to convey a set of ideas just using pictographs. You'd have to sit there and sort of draw tons and tons of imagery out. And so another alternative way that civilizations decided to express some of their ideas was in a logographic format. And in these logographic formats, you basically have a particular visual representation, such as the character A, that corresponds to a sound that we would make with our mouth. Now, in the case of these logographic languages, really what you're trying to do is combine together a sequence of symbols so that you can get the person reading or viewing the image or sequence of images to hear a sound in their mind's ear. Now, in the English language, for example, there's 26 of these images or characters in the alphabet, and we string those together to construct thousands of words. So we might, for example, string together some of these to create a word furious or to create a word sunshine. And, most of the time when we're looking at the characters, there is a pretty good mapping between what we see on the page and the way that the word sounds. Not always, of course, but most of the time. So F makes the sound F, U makes R makes I makes I. And so we might, if we were trying to read this, go furious. We could do that as, little children do, for instance, when they're first learning to read and write. And so this is the way that we try to convey ideas. Well, obviously, the alphabet and the spelling of words don't perfectly capture the underlying sounds. So consider, for example, that the same character can have a different sound. The C in cell sounds different than the C in cake. Or the different characters can sound the same. The PH in phone sounds the same as the F in foot. And then, of course, we have characters that make no sound at all and can completely throw off, the innocent reader. So the P in psychology is completely silent, for instance. Now, if you've grown up your whole life speaking a language, the idiosyncrasies in that language are probably not going to cause you an issue, such as the fact that P in psychology is silent, or that lamb ends with a B that doesn't have any sound, and so on and so forth. But of course, if you wanted a machine to be doing analyses of language, you could very quickly start running into problems because machines are very literal. And so if you told a machine that it needed to sound out a word and there was a P in there, it would in all likelihood try to sound out the P in psychology. Okay, well, what this tells us is that we might need a way to resolve some of the imperfections in mapping the words that we see into the sets of sounds that they imply. And there's a system called the International Phonetic Alphabet, IPA, that was developed actually to do this, to map, in fact, all sounds found in all human languages onto, representation, so that if you wanted to rewrite a sentence with respect to the actual sounds that are needed to generate the words in that sentence, you could theoretically accomplish that. Okay, so for example, in IPA, they use this alpha character to represent the ah in balm or bot, ot. So you can see the ah sound is represented by this. Okay, and similarly, for example, the ah in comma, which is different than bot. So ah, comma ah, which are slightly different. Just wanted to point those two out as an example because they have a little bit in common, but there's still differences in them, is represented by this symbol. Now, there's also if you're an English language speaker, there is a sound kind of encoding that's a little easier to follow because it uses English characters called ARPABET. And I've got listed here, for example, both the ARPABET as well as the IPA representations, as well as an example that you can kind of map between. So let's talk about some of the terminology that accompanies this way of thinking about language, this kind of sound-centric way of thinking about language. A phone is a basic unit of sound. So f, g. Those are phones. These are the absolute independent of language, sounds that our mouth can make that we string together in order to generate words in different languages. A phoneme is a unit of sound that distinguishes one word from another. So these exist relative to a language. Okay, a morpheme is a basic unit of meaning. This might be a word or a subset of a word, and a grapheme is a basic unit or symbol of writing. So for example, as I mentioned, a phone in the case of this example of sheep is the sh sound. A phoneme is the sh in sheep and versus the ch in cheap. So you can see this, they're distinguished by, these two are distinguished, the eep here and the eep here. What changes it from sheep to cheap is that ch versus the sh sound. Okay? So how do we go about generating sounds? Well, it really happens in 3 stages. The first is we exhale and our lungs push air up through our windpipe, shown down here. And then our vocal folds constrict the airflow. They kind of tighten up so that you get a vibration, and that vibration is what sound is. It's just the vibration of air. And then as that air is vibrating, we kind of change the shape of our mouth. We might constrain our nasal cavity or move our tongue around, clench our teeth, so that we can create various sounds that finally emanate out of the lips. Nasal sounds are created by directing airflow into the nasal category. So that's n, ng. There are also stop sounds that have to do with quickly sort of closing your lips. So p, p. You see that a closing of the lip is involved when I do that, or d, d. There's a rapid stop that corresponds to the movement of the tongue. And similarly with vowels, these are created through constrictions of airflow with the tongue and the lips. So ah, or oo, or e. So you kind of reshape your mouth to accomplish each of those. And then there's the frictive, which are created by constrictions in airflow with the teeth and the lips. So that's z, s, f, sh, etc. Okay, I bring these up because when we're going to be doing the analysis of the audio waveforms later, What you will find if you get deep into this area is that the sounds which are nasal are easy to confuse for each other. The sounds that have stops in them might also have qualities that make them confusing when you want to discriminate between one or the other. And similar with these fricatives, for instance. Now, there's another very important attribute of speech that's beyond just the phones. And those attributes are referred to as prosody. That's changes in the rhythm and tone that convey usually a higher order meaning. So duration, pitch, energy, all these have a prosodic quality to them that help emphasize things, convey questioning, convey emotion, such as anger or sadness. Okay, and note that in some languages, such as Chinese, for example, pitch is used to distinguish between the meanings of words, and that can create all sorts of complications for non-native speakers when they first enter the language. So some examples that I wanted to give to sort of highlight the importance of prosody when understanding a sentence is, so if I say George bought a dozen eggs, a carton of milk, and a bag of sugar, okay, versus George bought only one bag of sugar. So sugar, bag of sugar versus bag of sugar. You can see how the way that the word sugar is pronounced in these two cases sounds different. And the difference in the way that it sounds communicates something about the fact that this is a question in this case and it's not in this case. Specifically, this uptick in the pitch is what we're catching when we say bag of sugar. Okay. So here I could say, did George buy any fruit? Yes. And notice that similarly, if I change this yes to say yes, that would indicate that I was uncertain in the answer. Okay, so this is just a way for me to emphasize that the point of speech is not just to convey these symbols that you see on the page, but there's meta information that's embedded that's beyond just the symbols and the sounds. Now, what we were seeing was changes in the pitch when I looked at yes versus yes in the previous examples. Pitch is the perceptual correlate of what's called the fundamental frequency, which is the frequency of your vocal folds vibration. That's sort of like the base frequency that gets melded by all the other cavities in your mouth, the movement of your tongue, and placement of your teeth to generate the sounds that come out the other side. Okay, and then loudness or amplitude, you might hear it referred to some other places, is the perceptual correlate of power in the signal processing domain. So it's related to the square of the amplitude of the signal. Now, in the next component, we're going to be speaking a little bit more about how we take these speech signals, and first and foremost, how our physiology does interpretation of them, and then speaking about how we can, in a computational environment, do processing of signals that are similar to how our physiology does the processing.